Is ChatGPT going to destroy the world?
I think it makes it a little bit more complicated.
All right. Stephanie Edgley, professor and associate dean from the Medill School at Northwestern. Welcome to the Public Diplomat.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right. We're going to talk about the news media and news and social media audiences. Stephanie, what is the news? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's I like to say it's a deceptively simple question, with a really messy, not simple answer. A lot of my research lately has been asking this simple question of showing people a news story or a headline or a tweet, and then asking them to what extent do they consider this news. And it's really interesting because there are some patterns, some overall patterns, if you will, like breaking information. People are more likely to think that that's news. But there are also a lot of differences, right? It's sort of individualized, and defining news is super tricky. Here's your YouTube headline for you. I like to say, news is sort of like pornography. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. And that's really what's been interesting with a lot of my research, is to tap into that gut instinct of, here's a story, in your mind is this news. And that can be really powerful in both thinking it's news or not thinking it's news, right? And if we think something's news, we tend to think it's more trustworthy or more credible. We tend to think that we don't need to verify it. And if we don't think something is news, or we would not call something news, we tend to think that it's not valid, it shouldn't be trusted, and we kind of diminish its power. And so that's the space that I kind of play in. And you see predictable, partisan.
We'll get into all of that. And thank you for giving me the title of this podcast, right?
Oh, no.
All right. So the news media has always been called the fourth estate of democracy, right? And it's supposed to protect us, the people, from government, right, from the elites, from corporation, etc., and provide us with information that is trustworthy. And yet, when you look at public opinion in polls for the last 20 years, we see a steep decline in public trust in news sources. Let's talk about the diminished trust and why it may be important.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing to talk about. And I think it's, there's not one easy answer. I can sort of answer this in different parts. I think when we compare to 20, 40 years ago, when you're asking people, how much do you trust the news media, right? Or how much do you trust the news, right? That image, it sort of goes to what I was talking to you about earlier about what is news. Like the image you have in your mind of who is the news media, or what is journalism, and who am I considering when I'm evaluating? That is a really crowded, colorful container that we're asking people to evaluate with trust questions. And so in a lot of ways, I think it makes sense that people are less trusting, because the object that you're evaluating with your trust has become a lot more variable. There's a wide range of different assortments of communication that is happening. So in one way, I think it might be an artifact of the object that we're asking people to evaluate that has morphed and looked very different. Maybe another way that you could look at this is that people in general in the US are more distrusting of institutions. So yes, the news media, journalism, absolutely, but you see a similar steep, steady decline with banks, with politics, with the police, right? And so you can tackle each of those very individualized, and there are very specific answers for them within. But I think it's also an interesting question to grapple with kind of culturally. What does it mean in the US to see many big institutions decline in trust, and the news media being just one of them? So I guess those are kind of the two big macro answers I'd give you with the decline in trust.
Well, those are good answers, but let's put the mirror in front of the news media and say, look, they earned it. They earned it. The rise of partisan media, for example, the rise of native advertising in the media that puts, commercial content, disguised as traditional news, the strong political bias, right, for different news outlets. I mean, did they earn it in a way?
I mean, who's the they, right?
News organizations. large news organizations, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, the Time magazine is a LA Times.
I mean, even in those, there's a wide continuum there, right? Like I would say the track record of Time magazine is very different than the New York Times. Should we blindly trust any source? No. Like maybe don't even blindly trust what your mother tells you, right?
There we
There's
go.
that old saying at Medill, when your mom tells you she loves you, you better fact check it. Right? And
We're talking about facts. Let's talk about the concept of fake news, right? It really became very popular with Donald Trump during his first campaign, the fake news media. What is fake news?
yeah, and I would position this within a conversation of what is news. And my
That's it.
opinion about this is that it's a rhetorical technique to devalue things that you don't want people to trust or think really hard about. So it's a powerful label, that a big umbrella term that gets people to just stop listening to something or considering something, right? By saying something's not news. I think it also makes people, in general, it can be an effective tool by when you introduce that into the conversation, right? Kind of like a framing or priming technique, people just start automatically distrusting things. So I like to say that I'm maybe less worried about people, trusting things that are fake, but I'm much more worried about people not trusting things that are true. Right. And that's really the danger I see with this concept of fake news and using it as a big umbrella term, is that it just is too all encompassing, and it has some really negative effects on how people process information.
Absolutely. When social media came about, I know you remember this, right? Early on, there was a promise of democratization of the marketplace. The social media is going to make democracy better and the journalism world better, thanks to the empowerment of the citizen journalists, thanks to multiple sources, etc. But we see that social media has had both positive and negative outcomes on the world of journalism. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, isn't it just technology in general that the newest, shiniest thing we want to believe is going to, solve all of our problems? So I do remember this. And I mean, we still have this with the latest techniques, the latest tools, the latest thing is going to save journalism and save democracy. I personally think that we put a lot of pressure on social media to solve some of the issues that were facing the journalism industry pre-social media. So I'm thinking even before 2004 and the advent of Facebook, the news industry had a aging audience problem, right? And that their audience, their key demographic was older and not younger, right? And so social media comes about as a way to, oh my gosh, reach young people, right? Because it's a very young person space, not so much Facebook anymore, but look at all these spaces, TikTok, Instagram, and you hear news organizations that want to be on that space because that's where young people are. And oh my gosh, we need young people. And I just think it's misunderstanding how we use these spaces, and that, a news organization could just show up onto the space and all of a sudden, somebody's gonna be like, oh, okay, I should buy your newspaper, right? Or I should subscribe to your content. So in some ways, I think, social media was positioned among journalists and for news organizations as a way to solve some of their pre-existing problems that just were sort of unrealistic. And then it exacerbated some other problems like the advertising industry. It sort of broke that model. So now you're dealing with how to make money, and that's where you get things like native advertising.
Which will ultimately potentially risk both the journalism space and the advertising space by, given good reason to not trust either one of them. Let's talk about the fact that the rise of social media and its convergence, or the convergence of news organizations over there, trying to go on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, etc., gave rise to the new fifth estate of democracy, or maybe of dictatorship, which is tech companies. We have a handful of tech executives who get to decide what we're allowed to say, what we're not allowed to say, and how we're allowed to speak about salient topics in society. Is this a danger to democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would frame it at, is it a danger or disadvantage to news organizations, right? And therefore, democracy is sort of the lens I would thread with that. And I would say that early on, there was a lot of enthusiasm, right? That these tech companies wanted to partner and were willing to kind of sell this promise of reach, right? Like audience reach, grow your reach. And we can help you do that. You just give us your content and we will give you the eyeballs. And I think, as I was talking about, that was a really seductive promise for a lot of news organizations. And now, maybe we are in the more adult stage of news organizations' relationship with these tech companies and platforms. And you're seeing that a lot of news organizations are realizing that they gave up a lot of power and were trying to build relationships off-site that they did not control, which means when Google or when Facebook wants to make a decision for their own company to tinker the algorithm, to not allow, not kick someone off, to, have certain sources look exactly the same, even though they're wildly different, in terms of credibility or quality of information or factuality. Facebook, for example, has very different standards of what they are adhering to, and it's not journalistic principles. So I think there's a big realization, a big danger now that news organizations are having to wrestle with in using these spaces, but not being dependent on them, and wanting to collaborate, but not realizing that you can't be too dependent on that collaboration because it's ultimately not serving your interests, your journalistic interests, because these tech companies are not journalism companies.
The point, right? Well, we spoke about platforms that could shade democracy. Let's talk about the one platform that everybody's freaking out about, which is Chat GPT. What took Netflix and YouTube and Facebook years to gain, which is over 1 million subscribers, took Chat GPT 5 days exactly. Is this new platform of artificial intelligence where content creation can be created by artificial bots, right? And news stories can be created by artificial intelligence. Is this a real danger in the future of journalism?
Yeah, there's two ways I look at this. One is the panic that happens among journalists and inside newsrooms. I think this was really similar maybe to the panic that happened with MOOCs at Inside Higher Ed, which was like, oh my gosh, they're going to get rid of everybody and we'll just have one person that teaches thousands of people. I think panic is misplaced to some extent. I think AI in news stories is not going to replace the role of a journalist. I think it can do some very helpful things with supervision that can potentially free up journalistic resources to do things that AI cannot do, right? And so that's really where I try to position it in, embrace the technology, be smart about the technology and what it's going to enable you to do that humans are better at, right? That's kind of one aspect of it. The other thing is communicating this information to the public. Right. And that's where you the whole nother ball wax, right? Because the public's perception, as we talked about, of journalism is already kind of negative. And so it's really important to be transparent about what's being written by an AI bot and what's not. And it's really important to be double checking what these AI machines are writing, because it can be really embarrassing and it can damage your credibility holistically if it starts getting out like we have right now with CNET, with a whole bunch of stories that were written by bots and not really disclosed that they were, and now they have a whole bunch of errors in it.
It's a really good point, but I would enter the word yet into the conversation. This is Chat GPT version 1. Remember your iPhone 1, right? You can really play Tetris on the iPhone 1. You can really use TikTok on the iPhone 1. My iPhone 14 can do what a computer could have done 40 years ago, right? So just imagine the possibilities of Chat GPT and all of its competitors coming from, the big tech companies in the coming years. It's going to be fascinating. And I don't know if I even have the imagination to know what these tools can potentially do in the future and how it's going to impact journalism. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it really stresses to me, and this is maybe a similar conversation to when deep fakes came around, where it was like, whoa, like how, maybe our news literacy things were like, look really hard at a manipulated image and you can tell if something's been photoshopped. And then you had deep fakes, which were like showing you that you can't tell. And I think that really rocked people to the core a lot, because it was like, how do I stand a chance here? And I'm hearing like a similar thing with bots and the artificial creation of things is like, oh my gosh, this can be used for bad. How am I supposed to be able to tell, like smell out that this is bad when it looks fine, right? And so for me, I hear that and I think it's scary, and I think it makes critical thinking and question asking, because I too can't imagine what this is going to look like, right? It's going to be all hologrammy and like zapping into your retinas. And, so I think to some extent we need to ask critical thinking questions that are timeless, that can be applied to whatever new technology is out there. But I also think it's really important, and this is the conversation with deep fakes, is having watchdogs that are experienced in this area of tech journalism, right? This is where we need journalists. I'm going to get on my high journalism horse here. We need, people who are knowledgeable in technology fields and understand how this technology works and want to do the investigative research on how this information spreads and what it's going to look like, and identifying it and then communicating it to the mass audience or the mainstream media when we have videos or stories that have come out. And so it becomes really key that if the public on their own cannot identify these things, that we have experts, and I would say experts in trusted journalism venues, that can do this work and then can communicate it out to the public.
Stephanie, I think you just laid out the next 5 years of academic research in journalism, pretty much. Final thought. You sit in the Dill School, one of the best journalism schools in the nation. What advice do you have for your students and young people going into the field of journalism as they look forward to all the challenges and opportunities facing the field?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be kind of cliche with the like journalism professor bingo card where I say, there's never been a better time to be a journalism student. But my advice is to look around at how people's relationship with news has changed and how people are doing some really interesting and maybe also some scary things with news, and ask questions about what role news plays in society and what types of questions we need to be asking and answering as members of the news media, right? And that can mean any kind of thing. I'm not saying like stenographer out there at the courthouse, but journalism is such a big tent. At least for me, it's a big tent. And there are really a lot of important stories in tech, in Hollywood, in the music industry, as well as in politics that need people that have a diverse skill set. So come one, come all. If you're, interested in questions about media and democracy and privacy and technology, go to a journalism school.
All right, definitely. And it's such an important field for protecting our democracy, despite its challenges, right? Stephanie, always interesting, always smart. Thank you very much for coming on The Public Diplomat today.
Thank you for having me.